Hello, and welcome to Tank Gym Academy. I'm Paul Gorman, and today we're picking up on part 2 of our Strength and Conditioning series lecture, part of our Intellectual Nourishment series, where we talk about perspective on strength and conditioning programs and how I believe they evolved and developed over time. Hopefully you caught part 1. If you didn't, check our YouTube channel at Tank Gym or our website, tankgym.com, and you can view that. Let's jump to it. So again, this is part of our Tank Gym Academy Intellectual Nourishment series. And this is part 2 of our Strength and Conditioning and Perspective series, looking at the early 40s and 1950s up into the early 2000s. If you missed out on the first part, one of the things I think you need to do first is define strength and conditioning and health and fitness for yourself before you start to define that for others and individuals and teams, and help them to define that for themselves as they come to you. For our clients, we want to know what their goals are, their interests are, help them understand and define that, and then build our programs around it. Once again, all those individuals are going to have different perspectives on what they think the best exercise or program or system is to get them in shape. And if you ask 100 people, you're going to get 100 different answers on what that program or system is. A little bit of my background again, I'm a PTA, ATC, CSCS. I've been fortunate to be a part of functional movement systems for several years. For the FMS, the SFMA, Y balance test, I've successfully attended and completed the HKC and the RKC, and have had a wealth of experience to be exposed to some of the leading individuals in strength and conditioning education. And I encourage you to do the same thing. So seek those people out, learn from them as broadly as you can from as many individuals as you can, and help form your ideas and your programs for yourself. So we're going to go back just a little bit, and if you missed out on part 1, we kind of set the stage and talked about early strongmen and performers and different systems and programs that were out there. So touching on Charles Atlas again, nobody wanted to be this kid on the beach getting sand kicked in their face. Charles Atlas had a program called Dynamic Tension, which was essentially based on isometric programming, and 3 different times he was investigated by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, 1931, 36, and 1952. Each time they found and ruled in favor of him, but the reason a lot of those investigations happened was because infighting between different factions of strength and conditioning and performers, and articles, so both slander and libel from individuals. And one particular individual, Mr. Hoffman, wrote that he thought dynamic tension was dynamic hooey, and he asserted that the use of dumbbells, barbells, other apparatus were essential in training athletes. That's important to remember because there's a long history. If you remember in part 1, we talked about Sandow and Sampson. They sued each other. You talked about Arthur Saxon and Sandow, how they had litigation against each other. Again, all these long history of performing strongmen suing each other, each claiming to be the best and the strongest in their technique the best. We talked a little bit about Jack LaLanne. So again, Jack LaLanne, if you're not familiar with him, North American culture, we definitely owe him an awful lot from that standpoint. He noticed a lot of changes in the early 30s and 40s and opened up what is considered one of the first health clubs in California. He pioneered and innovated a lot of the machines that you see today in the gym are modeled after that: leg extension, weight selector machines, cable pulling machines. He noticed a change in culture after the wars, that people didn't move the way they did. We were no longer an agrarian society. We were an industrial society. We lived and moved and had different habits and different movement patterns, and could no longer perform the way we saw younger soldiers as a model in those late 1800s, early 1900s. And he tried to implement some changes that would facilitate that. So we talked a little bit about the U.S. Army Training Guide for 1914. And we're going to jump ahead now to 1941, where the U.S. Army implemented some changes to that guide. So if we look at the 1941 model, the bottom half, everything under the endurance and agility arch, were things that were implemented in the first manual of 1914. The discipline in setting up exercises, the marching and the running, the jumping, vaulting, climbing, crawling, lifting, throwing, grappling, all those kind of things were in the 1914 manual. In 1941, they thought they needed to add discipline of endurance and agility and health and fitness and try to better define some of those concepts. The other thing they started to do is they tried to measure those concepts. So they set some parameters, some standards that they thought that the men should be able to attain to be a good soldier, to be a good warrior athlete. Throws, hops, jumps, standing, running. They tried to set a few benchmarks so that they could rate and rank those individuals to better determine their preparedness and readiness for battle. Earlier, we also talked about several of the different strongmen and weightlifters that influenced early culture. We're going to move ahead a little bit again and see kind of the progression of that. Bob Peoples is the next one we're going to talk about. He was a weightlifter, strongman at the time, and at weighing in 181 pounds, he was deadlifting 700 plus pounds in the 1940s. He was the first lifter to implement and was credited with negative or eccentric style training. In the long tradition of weightlifters and strongmen and performers, he too published Developing Physical Strength in 1979. Again, it's important to remember that all these performers, they had their systems and their programs, their courses that they thought was the best route to become big, fast, strong, and perform lifts correctly. And one learning from the other, we continue to grow and develop. So something started happening again in the 40s and the 50s. There was a little bit of a cultural shift. So we're going to talk about some of the sport, particularly the sport of Olympic weightlifting, and see how that influenced a little bit of what we call program design now and how that was based. So Olympic weightlifting really is referred to in many ways. You'll hear Olympic lifting, powerlifting, weightlifting, weight training. All these things are kind of thrown around interchangeably, and it's important that we better define that so that we can have an educated conversation between individuals in the profession and our clients so that we can define that and so know what we're talking about and when we're talking about it and how to apply it appropriately. So when we look at Olympic weightlifting, some of the short history of that is really it grew out of some of the strongman lifts. So we see an iteration of this in 1896 in the Summer Olympics. There was the clean and jerk, which was a two-handed lift, and there was a one-handed lift, a snatch. In 1904, there was a clean and jerk, which was a two-handed lift, and then an all-around dumbbell, or what we know as a bent press. So that was Olympic weightlifting at that time. Those were the events, and they had to standardize to a certain extent what those lifts were and how they could be performed. But again, if you go back to the early great competition where we had strongmen competing, that's where we're trying to standardize terminology and techniques. And as we move forward, you'll see some of those struggles. We'll start to see some different variations on the one-handed and two-handed lift, and this was a part of the problem in the Olympics as we're judging and grading individuals. Who wins? Okay, so since 1920, we've had Olympic weightlifting at every Summer Games. Okay, so let's define it a little better. Olympic weightlifting. It is a sport in which participants attempt a maximum weight single lift of a barbell loaded with weight plates. All right. Currently, there are two lifts competed in Olympic weightlifting: the clean and jerk and the snatch. The clean and press was included at what time, but because of difficulty judging proper form, it was eliminated. That's important, okay? For the sport of Olympic weightlifting, we have certain technique that each individual must hit in order for it to be considered a good lift. We think Olympic weightlifting tests the ballistic limits of an individual, and they are executed faster and ballistically. And there are relatively few competitive Olympic weightlifters currently. A small number, a limited sport, and that's important because there was a cultural shift that we're going to see and talk about in a little bit that I think contributed to that some. Okay, so we talked about Jack LaLanne a little bit earlier. It's important to know as he saw all these changes happening in society that we mentioned earlier, he really, this was his thing. He reached out to everybody. He had the Jack LaLanne Show. In 1951, it was the first workout program on television, and his cheerful urging at every program was get up, work out, and feel better. And that's how he opened and closed almost every show until 1985 that ran. Odd lifts, late 40s, early 50s, odd lifts. Again, if you remember from part one, and if you haven't seen part one, head back to tankgym.com and find that link in that series course that we talked about, some of the early development of strongmen, and odd lifts really grew out of our old strongman sports. Okay, we started to standardize our strongman sports. Olympic weightlifting grew out of odd lifts. Okay, so a little more history on that. Powerlifting also grew out of odd lifts. Okay, so powerlifting, it's a strength sport resembling Olympic weightlifting because both disciplines involve bars and weights and lifting in 3 attempts. Powerlifting further evolved from odd lifts because it was more like the strongman event. Okay, we had the 2 main events in Olympic weightlifting, and what happened was there were a lot of competitors that wanted to do the other cool stuff that the old strongman did, that the Olympics dropped out because of the difficulty of determining a winner and proper technique and scoring it again for that sport. So powerlifting picked up all the other stuff that Olympic lifting did not do any longer. All right, so we had strongmen who had competitions that grew into odd lifts, that grew into Olympic weightlifting, and Olympic weightlifting refined it down to 2 events. Many people decided they want to still do the other things, and powerlifting started to grow out of that. Okay, so now we have 2 different sports with 2 different goals and 2 different sets of rules on determining what is a good lift, what is a standard lift. Today, traditional 3 events in the sport of powerlifting are squat, bench press, and deadlift. And most meets can be performed raw or equipped, and that means either with or without braces, wraps, and so forth. All right. There were 2 main governing bodies in the US and the UK, and they each had a little bit different variation on the rules for what are the correct performance of those techniques. So we're going to see that kind of be an issue again as we come forward. In 1964, the York Barbell Company sponsored an event. They sponsored a competition. Okay, the York Barbell Company is pretty interesting and important to remember. Okay, so Bob Hoffman was the owner of the York Barbell, and he was a longtime adversary of the sport. And here's the thing: Olympic lifting equipment and power lifting equipment are very similar. But savvy marketing differentiated those 2. And Bob Hoffman was the owner of York Barbell. Okay, we also remember Bob Hoffman was also the one that raised a lot of the lawsuits against Charles Atlas, which instigated some of the Federal Trade Commission investigations. Okay, so again, we have strongman performers and equipment owners and sellers suing each other, and then you move forward a little bit, and Bob Hoffman finds himself at the center of an argument again about who sells the right equipment. Well, Hoffman lost some sales of Olympic style equipment to a guy named Joe Weider. Joe Weider started developing Olympic lifting equipment, so Bob Hoffman tried to rebrand and remarket and move out. So now we've got some competition going on there in that direction. Again, you're doing it differently, therefore you're doing it wrong. That's a big thing in our health and fitness culture, and we've seen that before. Just because you're doing it differently than me, obviously you're doing it wrong. Okay, and that's where we fail. We need to change that attitude. Looking at another strongman, Slim the Hammerman. So again, Slim the Hammerman, he grew up, he was watching the Mighty Atom. Remember we talked about the Mighty Atom in part 1 and all the feats of strength there? Well, Slim decided he too wanted to be a performing strongman, and he wanted to perfect some of these techniques. He was famous for all his hammer lifts. Tons of YouTube videos and information out there on these guys. I encourage you to look them up. And again, they all had their courses and their books. Reg Park, here's another little bit shift in time. So Reg Park is a good place for us to start to talk about some of the shifts. So we've talked about strongmen and performers, and we talked about bodybuilding just a touch, and it really wasn't bodybuilding at that. So that went into odd lifts, and odd lifts became bifurcated again. There was Olympic lifting and powerlifting, and then everybody suing everybody in there. And we moved forward just a little bit more, and we had dynamic tension in our isometrics, and we had a look that we thought was attributed to physical health and wellness. And then we move a little bit closer to something we'll notice as bodybuilding. So now we're not necessarily going for function, we're going for looks. Reg Park was Mr. Universe in 51, 58, and 65, and he's on record as the first bodybuilder to bench 500 pounds, and there he is with his Reg Park chest expander. So then we look at Joe Weider, again, you know, in that same model. Joe Weider was a strength and conditioning guy. He was a performer and a lifter, and he had product. Again, remember, he got into it with Hoffman, and they were competing for sales. Joe Weider went through and he created the International Federation of Bodybuilders. He started the Mr. and Mrs. Olympia and the Master Olympia bodybuilding contest. So again, marketed programs. As we take a look at 1965 and Larry Scott and Coulter as an example of kind of where we started in Mr. Olympia competitions and then where we progressed, look at the definition difference, and it just, you know, training techniques and the equipment and thoughts and programs and design, everything changed, but that's a heck of an evolution. So talking about Joe Weider again, he also published many magazines, so he's another big contributor to physical culture in North America and shaped a lot of our thoughts in visual pictures of what health and wellness and fitness look like. He also sold a line of fitness and fitness equipment and supplements. Moving forward to a little more current day, Dave Whitley down in Nashville, Tennessee. Dave Whitley is a traveling strongman who has studied all these guys from history and tried to incorporate all the techniques and knowledge from the old days with what we know about current exercise science and strength and conditioning and performance and mastering the mind and the body. He too is an iron bender and a phone book ripper, and there he is rolling a skillet. He does travel and perform to this day. He's been a part of the RKC community, the Strong First community, and I encourage you to seek him out and check out his information and material and presentations as well. We've seen an awful lot about kettlebells in most all of these strength and conditioning guys and these strongmen and the performers. Again, we talked a little bit about the history of the kettlebell, been around as early as the early 1700s, is some written documentation. In the past 5 or 6 years, there has been much more information out there about kettlebells from a research standpoint. Kenneth Jay started looking at that, you know, that capacity, head and neck, back pain, and the influence of a hardstyle kettlebell swing. There have been many others that have looked at studies, oxygen cost of kettlebell swings versus VO2 max on a treadmill. Okay, the RKC Manmakers is the protocol that they use for that. Okay, there have been a couple studies that have looked at lifts and carries and push and pulls, so suitcase carries, farmer walks, bottoms up carries, in comparison to barbell back squats and spending less time under load in a barbell back squat and redirecting to some asymmetrical and symmetrical carries has some benefit to performance and injury prevention. Many other studies, again, looking at kettlebells and their performance versus dumbbells and barbells at particular sports for martial arts, for hockey, looking at that compared to cardiorespiratory responses of other activities. Researchers have looked at kettlebell training compared to traditional Olympic lifting. Again, so we're kind of see some of the old and some of the new, and in that same time age argument, who's better, you know, performance standpoint. Is it powerlifting? Is it Olympic lifting? Is it kettlebells? Is it, well, the answer is there's not one strong answer. There's many different ways to get there. And again, everybody's going to pick a different goal, a different desire. They're interested in activities that may not necessarily be the activities you're interested in, but the goal is, again, to maximize their performance, to make that individual the best they can be. We'll also take a look in a different intellectual nourishment series. We'll look at the kettlebell research and I'll assimilate that a little bit better, and we'll talk in depth about what's going on and available out there and kind of sum up those references a little bit better. But I just want to give you a glimpse of some of the things that are going on out there, and that's, you know, the old is new again. One of the great places to start would be with Pavel, Enter the Kettlebell or the Russian Kettlebell Challenge. Those two are great introductions to get your hands on, and then you can seek out some of that research. Another area that's begun to gain some popularity in the research world is traditional strongman events as we know them today, and how traditional they are, I don't know, but we're talking about tire pulls, car push pulls, lifts, Atlas stones, suitcase carries, barrel throws and tosses, axles, pummels, all those kind of lifts, sled pulls. We're looking at the different automobile pulls in the strongman competition, the junkyard training, if you will. So again, we'll explore that a little bit later too. But that kind of brings us up to current time in the early 2000s as we kind of look at how some of those things have evolved, where we were in the past, and how we define that. So specifically, when you talk about powerlifting and Olympic lifting and kettlebells, and again, my main thing is know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and be able to define that for yourself, and then define that for your clients and your athletes. I hope you check out part 1 if you haven't seen that, and then head over to the site and check out part 3 where we pick up and we talk a little bit more about rehab, and eventually we'll get to where we're talking about youth and how strength and conditioning can be integrated there. Thanks again.